well, I'm doubting, so somebody's got to be doubting, so at least I exist so that I can doubt. So that one's unarguable because somebody's doing some doubting here, and I guess it's me. That's not directly translated from the French, but let's call that the New Living Translation of Descartes. So we have thinking that God is important. That's not the reason. The reason is selfishness. We want to be happy. We just want to be happy. And we want to be happy for as long as we possibly can. So what we really want to know is there such a thing as an ecstatic place or state or perfect place to be? And can we live forever? Right? Those are really, if you could wish for anything, if you had Aladdin's lamp, would you, and you could wish for this, would you wish for anything other than, I want to be blissfully happy, I want to live forever? Because all the rest of it's really entailed in those words. So if we're asking the question of how do I be happy and how do I be happy forever, well, one of the questions of how do I be happy forever might be if there's such a person as God, and that God lives forever, can he, she, whatever, help me live forever? Another question might be this. We talked a little bit about morality, and we said even if you were king of the world, if you were, you could imagine being duly elected by the people king for all time, and everybody adored you because you were a good person, you would be happy. If you were Hitler, and you made it to being king of the world by stomping everybody out that disagrees with you, would you be happy at the end of that, where your rule is based on tyrannical evil? And at the end, we all kind of basically interiorly said, at a minimum, you need to believe that you're right. Right? That may not be the same thing as being right, but you want to believe that you're good and you're right. You don't want to believe that you're evil. And you won't be happy if you do. You want to believe that. So, if there's something, if you want to be good, you have to know whether there is such a thing as good. And we talked basically very briefly, and we'll talk about it more in one of these arguments. If there is a God, then there is a definition for good in the key sense. If there is no God, then we've got to figure out, is there any other basis for really something being objectively good for evil? Or are we going to make it up? And if we're going to make it up, we need a system for making it up. And if we're not going to make it up, then what's the way of figuring it out? But the first question you got to ask is somebody else setting the rules? And when you look around, even as forget being a religious observer of this, but we're aliens and we landed on planet Earth. And you say, what is one of the most common beliefs that these human things hold? You will find that almost all people believe in God. Almost all people. The vast majority of humanity believes in God. It doesn't feel that way in certain circles here in parts of Western culture. But don't forget that all of significant portions of the world believe in God. And even the ones who are kind of forced not to, when you ask them, tend to believe in a quote-unquote high power or quote-unquote destiny. Who sets the destiny? Well, we're not sure. Some part of the universe, etc. So the observation is there seems to be this either societally derived context that keeps God mainly in the background, or this natural belief that people have in God. So we want to answer the question of consider. By the way, I need to make a correction to what I said 2 weeks ago on the panentheism belief. I think I'm wrongly defined. I confused pan and poly. Poly meaning pan, one. So panentheism, I don't think we got the idea wrong, but my breakdown of etymology was incorrect. Polytheism, many gods, like Zeus and Ares and all that kind of stuff. Panentheism, God is the universe of one. That kind of thing. So, my apologies for that. Let's make an argument. Now, our question that we'll start with God. For all of those reasons, if those are insufficient reasons to you, then fine. We're in solid ground. We're Jews and Christians and atheists and skeptics. We want to figure out whether there's a God or not. Are there good arguments for God? And let me tell you what I mean by a good argument. A good argument is an argument that it's plausibly more true than its negation. Now that's fancy for saying it's more likely to be true than it is false. An argument for the existence of God. Then what that would say is, by this argument, it's more likely that a God exists than he doesn't exist. And you'll remember we talked a little bit about like the probability of existence. If we have a deductive argument, if you've got premise A and premise B, and you're 90% confident that premise A is correct, and you're 70% confident that premise B is correct, when you add them together, basically what you're saying is the weakest premise that I have, I'm 70% sure of, so I'm something like 70% sure. Now you can take 90% of the 70% if you want, that kind of thing. You can, depending on how you want to view it. But the bottom line is, if you have two premises, if you have a 51%, this is most likely true, this is most likely true, then really, in terms of deductive arguments, this is not, these are not these are not interdependent. So you know how when you try to combine probabilities, one of the questions that you think about is one probabilistic occurrence dependent on the previous state, that kind of thing. So if you are mostly confident this is true and mostly confident that's true, then we tend to be mostly confident that the conclusion is true. If you don't buy this right here, which you don't have to, then you can at least do the 90%, 70% and say that the result, or maybe say something easier, 50%. And so you can be 45% confident in this right here. And you might say, well, 45% confidence, did I do that right? Yeah. 45% confident, that's not confident enough for me to believe it. What about the negation? So if this was 90% true, there's a 10% chance that it's false. You know what I mean? Or your 10% chance that you're certain it's false. That's 50% here. So your resultant is, like if depending on which one you're kind of making the dependent one, in some ways, you can say that you're only 5% confident in this. So this is the better answer in either regime. Now, why are we doing this? Well, at the end of the day, we're trying to figure out a level playing field. It's not the case that the theist has the burden of proof. It's not the case that the atheist has the burden of proof. We're coming to this question naively. And there are people who argue a properly basic belief looks like this: God exists. So you're rational to believe that God exists until you find a defeater otherwise. You can make that argument. We're not going to in this class. We're going to treat it like it's, who knows? We just got to. All right. So what kind of evidence and argument do we want to use first? Now, and as much as y'all want to jump in, because if I haven't said it, both of us do a little bit of work in the apologetics kind of front here, and we tend to stand on exactly the same side on these arguments. And we will join forces against, he and I have actually linked up against a few Christians online who represent some of these arguments poorly. And I'm just as interested in defeating poor arguments as he is, maybe for different ulterior reasons, but at the end of the day, each of us believe that what we believe is true, and so we're driving after that truth. So anything that's not true, we should be jointly interested in and showing it not to be true, and that's what we are going to do. So in any case, jump in as much as you want with any variations on this or anything, anytime you feel the need.
So, kind of going back to we exist, it's either the case that there was a initial starting point for reality, for the universe.
Yes.
And I was trying to think of the alternative.
Yes. So Steve gets right to the heart of the matter.
It was always here, and so I'm trying. Basically, instead of focusing on the first part, I was trying to figure out if you could use this like the alternative if there wasn't a starting point.
Static universe.
A static universe.
Right.
How is that even?
Steve is making this statement. The universe exists, all right? Properly basic belief? Maybe. The bottom line is we look around us and we're like, all right, seems like a good hypothesis. There's this physical reality. I go run into the wall, it hurts. And it seems like something's out there.
We'll call that the universe. In fact, what we'll use is, now remember we said definitions are very important. Let's talk about what we mean by universe. Steve used the word, it's a good word, uni, one, verse, think in the same terms of like word or statement. But the bottom line is, it's a single statement of that which is real. Right? The universe is simply, and we'll probably say this, we'll modify it to say, at least to make it easier for us to talk about now, the physical universe exists. So when we say the physical universe, we mean everything that exists physically. Now that furthermore means, by because of this little thing, which you may have seen once or twice, that there's a matter and energy equivalence. So in our physical universe, what we mean by that is matter, which is interchangeable with energy. And then we'll add these two. We'll say space, because it seems like there's kind of like space that we move in. Maybe that's a construct, maybe it's real. Space and time. So these, at least our physical theories, when we talk about a physical universe, we talk about movements of these things right here, and these are the things in which they move. Am I making sense? So maybe space and time are eternal. Maybe matter and energy are eternal. Maybe they started at some point in the past. Okay, and that's what Steve's saying is the universe exists, and Steve's going to further say this: either the physical universe is eternal in the past, or it isn't. Okay, are we justified in saying this? Yes, we are, because this is one of our three rules of logic, right? This is A or not A. It's either the case that A, or it's the case that not A. It's either the case the universe is eternal in the past, or it's not the case. Now, again, physical universe, if it's everything, that means if there's such a thing as a multiverse, that includes that, because that's all physical reality. If the universe that we see is just a part of it, if there's more past it that we just can't see, that's just more physical universe. The same is true of that as well. Okay? So far, we've got some interesting statements. Now, why are we talking about the universe instead of God? I thought we were going to talk about God. We'll see in a second.
A third evidence, what would cause me to say there's a God, is the complexity and orderedness of the cosmos and of life screams something.
Okay, now
Ordered
hold on this thought right here, because there's going to be a second argument that runs down this inductive path. But right now we're going to try to make some deductive arguments first.
So it seems to me he was running down the Kalam cosmological argument.
It seems to you exactly correctly. Okay. Now
he
what?
Didn't state it quite like that, but that's what it is.
He is getting to that, and you're right to identify that that's where we're headed. So the idea behind as you're setting up for this is this argument he's talking about. The first premise of this argument looks like this. Now there are a few you can have multiple versions of an argument depending on what premise you want to back. So we'll use this one for now. If the physical universe began to exist, okay? If it began to exist, now we know that either it began to exist or it didn't. Could have been eternal in the past, could have not. But if it began to exist, then it has or had a cause. All right, now it seems like we might have injected a new principle in there. If it began to exist, then it had a cause. Where do we get that? Or did we just make that up? We got that, but we haven't argued for that yet. So we'll see if we agree with our definitions. Physical universe we know. Began to exist.
Everything that begins to exist has a cause.
So
Well, start.
At least that's
It all starts with the cause.
yeah, we want to say that if everything,
That's the first.
we might say it's a really good principle, causal principle out there. Things don't happen that are uncaused. So the opposite of if something happens, it had a cause. Think about what the negation of that is. if something happens, it didn't have a cause. Now, this would be to believe that things happen uncaused, not unknown what the cause is. That's different. I didn't know what the cause was. Does not equal there was no cause to this happening. But we say, well, how do you argue for this principle? Well, we're going to argue for it scientifically. We're going to argue for it observationally. If things, universes or things in general, if things pop into existence uncaused, out of nothing, then it's inexplicable why things aren't popping into existence uncaused right here. Right? Why are things not popping into existence right now? Why are things not appearing in the middle of this room? Why are things not appearing out in the universe? Now, by the way, people have argued that things are appearing out in the universe. The steady state guys argued for a long time that quasars were places where matter was coming into existence out of nothing and building new galaxies. That's what quasars were. That view has died off, but that was a scientific view for a very long time. Fred Hoyle and company believed that. And continue to argue, his acolytes continue to argue for that today, but there are not many of them anymore. But anything that began to exist, anything that begins to exist has a cause, as Peter points out, is a very successful principle, because its negation leads you to basically be able to believe anything can pop into existence. Now, it may be true, but that's just not what we see. What we see are events that when they occur, they always, always, always seem to have causes. So it's just a good operating principle, but again, it's not a law, it's not a rule. We don't know for 100% certain that that's the case, but to negate it gets really ugly really quickly, and you'll actually find out that that's
Newton's first law is the same thing. That's right.
Say again.
Newton's first law: things at rest stay at rest, things in motion stay at motion.
Yeah.
So changes have to have some kind of force.
That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah, and it's one of the it is the scientific principle, right? There's no part of the scientific method that says, we're gonna make hypotheses, we're gonna do observations, and then we're gonna do observations, we're gonna draw up a hypothesis of why this is, and we're gonna test it. Well, how can you test something if you're like, well, it popped into existence this time, but it's not gonna happen next time because this mysterious principle is operating all the time to just make stuff happen? It's not what science does. Science says, whatever happened for a cause. We're trying to figure out what the cause was. In fact, we're trying to figure out exactly how the cause operates so that we can tell you exactly what it's going to do next. That's what science is.
So let's say there is no causality in that.
Yes.
But let's just say for whatever. Does that undermine the process of arguing? You know what I mean? Like, because then you don't seem to have a coherent rule.
It's going to make arguing for stuff extremely difficult in a physical regime. You're immediately going to have to extract it out of a physical regime into a metaphysical regime. And then you're going to have to say, well, realities can occur. Things can come into existence all the time. That doesn't prevent me thinking. And if I'm going to think, how do I think coherently? But it's going to at least
like science would
introduce into your mind, the possibility that, well, I may be thinking a certain way, but who knows if popping into existence is not a new way of thinking that'll immediately take over the way that I'm thinking, and now I'm not thinking that way anymore, and so I can't be consistent in my way of thinking, because who knows if it'll change in the future, and I will never know that. So now you're into this weird kind of skeptical loop that does nobody any good, because you can't trust anything that you think. So maybe
the other option to that is the necessity of its being. So either you have to state that this, whatever it is,
Yes.
necessarily must exist, or that it has a cost.
Okay, so he's brought up another concept which we'll bring up, necessity, and we are going to talk about that, but we're not going to talk about that yet because that is a deep philosophical topic that requires a certain amount of treatment as well. Okay, so if we say if the physical universe began to exist, now note we're scoping this down. Peter's statement was if anything begins to exist, it has a cause, and that's we'll say one of the most highly successful metaphysical principles ever come up with. Right? That one, you can take that one to the bank, if you can take anything to the bank. But we're going to make it even more narrow, just in case. If the physical universe began to exist, then it has a cause. Okay? We just don't think that universes pop into existence out of literal nothing. Out of literal nothing. Now, nothing. This is very, very important. What is nothing? Okay, now I bring this up for a good reason. It's because when people start to lose the argument you're about to see, they immediately appeal to the idea that the quantum vacuum is nothing, or that some sort of physical reality is nothing. Peter.
Not anything.
And Peter's right. No thing. So nothing means when someone says, when we're talking about a principle, if the universe doesn't exist and it has a cause, we're talking about began to exist. What does it mean to begin to exist? It means before the thing began to exist, it did not exist at all. There was not, it was not. And then it began to exist, so now it is, and it continues. It still exists. What do we mean by that? Why are we saying that? The universe itself. If the universe began to exist, and the universe means space, time, matter, and energy, if that's what the universe is, then prior to the universe existing, okay, here's our timeline, here's where the universe begins to exist, all right, and off it goes, depending on your model, which this is not my model, but let's say it's something like that. On this side of the line over here, no universe. And no universe means no matter, no energy, no space, no time. Got it? That's the argument that we're making right now. If we're trying to be precise about what we're talking about, that's what we're talking about.
I don't mean to complicate things. but
Please do. That's what we're going to do.
hard time. Like either one of those two, it's almost impossible to wrap your head around, right? Like either the universe has always existed and never had a start. My brain just got broken.
Yep.
Or there was nothing. Like there was literally nothing. Like no quantum particles, no nothing. Right? And then it became something. Either one of those, like, doesn't fit within the construct of how we are able to imagine and process things.
No, I look to our brothers here to say, are we, on this side of the argument, are we saying that there was nothing? True nothing, not anything.
So I think you have to slip it to the physical. At least.
He's been very clear. The whole reason that he was talking about panentheism is we're not talking about nothing. God has created this out of himself in many ways, in some ways of thinking, right? That would be a statement you would say is accurate. So on this side, my point isn't that there's not anything. My point is that there's no universe. So over here can be other things. Math is over here. God is over here. Numbers are over here. Some people believe that these things are necessary constructs that exist regardless. But we're not saying that. All we're talking about is there's no universe over here. So you're right, but don't let that break your mind on this one. On the other side of this line can be things like God and math. And in fact, you'll hear this is what, if you pay really close attention to Hawking's book, The Grand Design, this is what he says sits on the other side of that line, the laws of physics. And that the laws of physics are, he doesn't say they're necessary laws, so he doesn't say where they come from. But he says, because of the laws of physics, universes will create themselves. That's what he says. Now, yes, skepticism, because he needs to do some more explanation on that. But he's saying that as we believe in God, and that he's the guy that sits on the other side of this line, that the laws of physics are God. And this is kind of consistent with some of what Einstein, he wouldn't have said it that way, but Einstein kind of believed something similar. Some people argue. Everybody likes to argue about what Einstein believed about God.
I get the whole emergence thing. I just don't see like the non-physical plane. I mean, you know what I mean? I don't see a scientist making an argument for the non-physical plane making physical being.
That's why
Say it
they were
again.
all shocked when the Big Bang Theory, the Big Bang was proven.
Yeah.
They still had an understanding in the 50s that they thought that they would find some slow bang, that it would, it came from something, right?
Well, yeah, and so my thing is like I'm inclined to believe, obviously, that God created. I'm inclined to believe there was nothing, and that it materialized after God created it. But I can't see Hawking's making that argument using, what I mean? I think that just doesn't make sense.
Right. So let me construct the argument then, and we'll get to its critiques in a second. But hold on to that, because that point does get made. The spoiler alert, Hawking has a no boundary idea about this one, and I'll explain what he means by that. But the problem with the no boundary condition that we'll look at later is it has some self-contradictory statements in it.
my admittedly limited understanding of the Big Bang is that there was particles of some sort that were small but expanded. And if that was the case, if that is true, then they existed.
So if the good news is don't worry about the understanding of how the Big Bang worked. Newsflash, nobody understands how the Big Bang works, because once you get down past a certain size, the way the physicists will put it is the laws of physics break down. What they mean is we don't have any idea how it went from singularity to this size, to this other point. And that's not like a critique. It's the tools they're working with don't let you see past that point, right? That's like the guy saying with the microscope, you're like, yeah, but what's smaller than the quark? Or what's smaller than the hydrogen atom? And the guy with the microscope is, I can't tell you. You're going to have to come up with a model, but my microscope doesn't work past this particular size.
But they had to have something, right?
So that, yeah,
model
so
that they use.
So the question then, if you go back to this kind of model, is if this is representing, typically this represents space, expansion of space over time. So time is going in this direction. And there's a theorem out there called the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, which is the formal statement of this, which is basically, if you take this clock right here and you wind it backwards in time, all these lines converge. That's all it says. It says it very rigorously, but it says if you back up a world that is expanding, it always comes back to a single point. Let me restate that because it's very important. And the way they state it is this: any world, any universe, and universe meaning all the stuff we talked about, any universe that is on average expanding, which our universe appears very much to be on average expanding, because here we are. If any universe that is on average expanding, when you run it backwards, has a finite point from which it came in the past, in this time regime. It basically says there is no time reverse. Now, some people will say, well, why couldn't it have been a big crunch down to a singularity that goes back to a Big Bang? All right, and maybe there's just an infinite series of these. Well, there are two reasons to think that that's not the case. First, with all the physics we know, this is impossible. You can never pull something down that's so well ordered that it goes back down to a singularity before it bounces back out. And some people who will talk about, well, it's a reversal and entropy. All that we mean by this is that when things go backwards in entropy, they go into a more organized state. Entropy is the level of disorganization. One thing that science believes today is that entropy is always increasing, always. There's an arrow of entropy, and some scientists, physicists have said that is synonymous with time. That the progression of time and the progression of entropy. When we say we're moving forward in time, what we mean is we're moving into more entropy, a greater state of disorganization. And so Sean Carroll said this. He says in the debate with William Craig, he says all this was happening is that this was an entropic, this was a state of entropy that is getting higher in entropy rather than lower in entropy, and so it's simply a reversal of time. And Craig pointed this out. He goes, that's still a beginning, because if that's just time working the other way, look what you actually got. There's two universes radiating from a single point in time. All right, so it's rare that this happens, but that was like a checkmate kind of thing, right?
Carroll was trying to avoid the beginning of the universe.
Right, and all he did was make two universes that originated in one. Yes, and so you can't say something causally sits on the other front, as Carroll was trying to say, as he points out, without saying, well, we're talking about things moving forward in time. That's just two separate parts of physical reality moving off that no longer intersect with each other, other than at that singularity.
So that single point is like a one-dimensional point that has no physicality. Like, you know what I mean? Like mathematically.
Yeah. So that one is a very deep philosophical question that we're not going to have to get into it here, because we'll say that at a minimum the math that we're using to do this requires you to get down to whatever we're calling that single point, that dimensionless point. Euclid calls a point that which has no parts. And if you like that for a definition, then fine. But whatever, the same kind of math point that you learned about in 9th grade geometry, that's what we're talking about.
I guess the reason why is I always just got the impression that it pre-existed, that there was something that.
Okay, yeah. I'm sorry, I forgot
to go, and so.
So why not this?
That's not possible.
Why not this? Here's Steve's point. Just ticking along through time. Point, 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 point. Wham! What just happened? All right, we blew up and now we got the universe. So what prevents us from having this point just having existed forever in the past?
There are all sorts of philosophical issues with that.
Sure, but are there any of them that make it not possible?
I mean, it's the whole question of, can you have a true infinite?
Okay,
Why would
yep.
it change states?
You know what I mean?
Yeah, whether an actual infinite occurs, whether
The whole
infinitism is
Hilbert
true.
kind of thing, you end up
Yeah.
with all sorts of non-logical craziness.
So he brings up some arguments against an actual infinity. That's one way of doing this. Is something that was sitting here going backwards in time without changing infinitely in the past is an actual infinity. And here are reasons to believe that there are no actual infinites. And Hilbert's Hotel is an example of a paradox that arises if you believe in actual infinity. So maybe you argue against it by saying that would represent an actual infinity and no such thing exists. That's one way to do it. What else?
There's also, you just said time. Well, if it's in the nothingness, there's no time.
Right.
So you could just collapse all those points into the same point if there's no time.
Okay, that's another way of doing it. In fact, that's my preferred way of doing it, is saying if you have no change, then there is no such thing as time. So it's not eternal in the past. But let's say that somehow there was time. Your thinking and my thinking on this is wrong. And in fact, these things kind of do tick. And maybe, let's say that the arguments against an actual infinite are unconvincing to some people. There are many mathematicians that believe in actual infinites today. In fact, I would say most do. So what prevents this from being the case? Peter.
If there was an actual infinite, or now we would have never gotten to now.
Okay, you're right, but that is, I think that falls into the
It's the same
category.
kind of thing.
Yes.
There's still the issue of a
Even
cause.
if there is an actual infinite concept, even if you grant that,
Okay.
then we would never be at now. But we are at now, so it's false.
But that to me is a reductio ad absurdum, that is a argument from contradiction that says if you buy these premises, then you end up with a contradiction at the end. At least I would still group that in the same group that he's talking about. So I'll bring up one more, which is we've got a causal problem here. If we said everything's going to happen, yes, right.
How did
So
it change states?
how did it change states? Where's the cause
Yeah.
that this thing was just I'm a dot, I'm a dot, I'm a dot, I'm a dot. I'm not going to expand today. On iteration number alpha null, I've decided to expand today. Where's the decision? How did that happen? Where's the cause for it? If it went from a dot to this point, and what caused that to happen was the previous point, then there's a causal chain here that clearly says there will be no variation from one to the other. So where's the law? Where's the physics? Where's the cause? Where's the thing that kicked it off? And the answer is there's no reason to believe that if it went this far, even from an infinite past, if you believe in that, if it went this far without changing, that at this point it changes of its own without any cause. Now we're back violating the causal principle again. And that's why this is not a very good argument. That's one of the three categories of why this may not be a good argument. Okay, so let's say that at this point we've at least got good reasons to believe that this idea of an eternal universe in the past is on shaky ground. Let's ask ourselves the question, in view of all that we've discussed, does it make sense to say if the physical universe began to exist, then it has a cause, right? We're just back to affirming the causal principle. We'll say, okay, all right. Now, do we have reasons to believe that the universe began to exist? Now, an argument from authority is not a good argument,
Sorry.
but I'll start there.
One question here. So, since everything's on the table and everything's fair game, right?
Yes, that's right.
I've never been out in space and looked at the Earth, but I'm pretty sure the Earth is not expanding, right? So in order to say that there's an expansion, in order to say there was a cause that kicked things off,
Yes.
can we say it's an assumption that the universe is expanding right now?
So
Call that an assumption?
Well, we don't have to yet. We don't have to yet. Here's what we're going to do. Now we're going to say this.
I don't think you have to assume that. The expansion of the universe is one of the most basic and most explored scientific concepts out there. There's very little that has been proven more than the expansion of the universe.
Yeah. So to your question, you're right. You can't. We are not looking at the. For instance, what you just said. The Earth is not expanding. That's correct. No, I don't think anybody thinks the Earth is expanding. What we think is expanding is space itself.
Sure. I guess my point being, we're leaning heavily towards the argument that there was nothing and then it popped into existence. So let's equally, I guess my point is like, let's give the other argument its equal weight too, right? That it has just always been.
Okay, so that's what we're saying. If the
Yeah.
universe began to exist, then the universe has a cause. So at this point, we haven't said that the universe began to exist. We haven't said it's not eternal in the past.
Which is different though than it's not expanding.
Right, that's
So
correct.
wouldn't expansion have to happen in order to prove the argument that it began to exist from a point?
If expansion happened, and the reasoning behind the Born-Guth and Blinken theorems are right, then you have reason to believe that expansion entails at least a point.
I'm failing to see how you could have a beginning of a universe in that argument without expansion.
But we haven't gotten there yet. It's the reason maybe the reason you're failing to see it. So let's continue.
Okay, cool.
So now, everything you're talking about has to do with this premise right here. The second premise is the universe began, the physical universe began to exist. All right, now,
You need another one though.
what's
I
that?
think you need to say that the universe is the only universe to eliminate.
Remember, and that's entailed in our definition
boundaries.
of, if you remember, that was in our definition of physical universe. Physical universe was everything that is matter, energy, space, and time. So if there's a multiverse out there, it includes all of those. If there's more to the the observable universe is not all of it, then it includes whatever's out there. When we make the statement, the physical universe, we mean all of physical reality, where all of physical reality means all of matter, all of energy, all of space, and all of time. That's what we mean. That's what we're trying to base our argument on, so that it covers, as Justin is probably pointing out here, all the cases out there. You don't want some universe hanging on out there that you didn't argue for.
Yeah, but it doesn't, I mean, I might be butchering it, but the bubble universe is that, these things spring up, right?
Yes.
And so they spring up out of something,
Yes.
which may not be time, matter, whatever.
The something out of which they spring is a quantum vacuum.
Yeah.
And that quantum vacuum is part of what we mean when we say the physical universe.
Right.
So we are including the quantum vacuum in that physical universe. So if for some reason you were not thinking whatever quantum physicists call the quantum vacuum, so quantum vacuum has to exist in space and time, right? The Schrodinger equations that define things that happen, there are time dependent and there are time independent equations, but none of them move. Nothing happens in them if it doesn't happen over time. There's no change of one quantum state to another quantum state that does not occur in time in any quantum mechanical viewpoint in the world.
Sorry, just for clarification, so that A and B that you got here,
Yes.
there's also another A and B.
Yeah,